Brandon, thank you so much for being on the show. Very much appreciate it. And also thank you for participating in our summit a couple weeks ago. We had a lot of fun, and I thought that was probably like the highlight of the event. So I really appreciate it.
Oh wow, that's awesome. Yeah, I was saying earlier like that panel was so much fun that I just wanted to come back and be on the pod. So here I am.
Yeah. Well, we really think a lot about community, and everyone has like their own opinion on go to market and what you should do. And we're a uh pretty young venture, right? So we really started to think about the business last January, and have been kind of building product for the last 6 months or so. But we're still pre-launch, right? Because we're still diving into those details and refining it, the product and the messaging and all that. And so, we some would argue maybe you don't want to like build or do marketing too early. Our DNA, at least within myself, is to go out there and build brand and start to build affinity with the market. I think it's a sticky thing sometimes, right? Because if you go out too early, um, it you could be targeting the wrong ICP, or those sort of things. But I think when you have a set persona that you really want to solve for, I think that changes it a little bit. And because we had, you met Justin, my co-founder, he was a product marketer, and we really had a very clear focus on what we wanted to solve for him. I think that makes it a little easier. So we just wanted to start to do community right out of the box.
That's awesome. And I think, and I don't know if this is, a new trend or if it has to do with, everyone moving virtually over the past few years, but I've noticed this trend, and I think it's a very healthy trend where, a lot of companies, even, solopreneurs and indie hackers are building a brand, building distribution prior to launch. And
Hmm.
I think it's super fascinating. I think it makes total sense in, today's day and age. So yeah, kudos to what you and Justin have built. To be honest, I had no idea you guys were pre-launch. Like, you guys have the community going. You've been out there on, on social. So, I mean, just goes to show that like you are building community even without the product being officially launched yet. So
Yeah,
that's pretty
well,
cool.
we have it in a private beta, so we do
Right.
have like about 20 companies right now using it underneath the hood, really helping us refine it.
Nice.
But yeah, but we're not public. We really wanted to kind of take our time, and so, but that is good. So it does really kind of uh you know do the trick there. But that's awesome. Well, why don't we dive into, you know, what is competitive enablement, right? Like, what does it look like? And maybe if you kind of thought about it from the perspective of launching, this effort pre-launch, what does it look at launch, and then what does it look like from a perspective of an ongoing basis?
Yeah, totally. To me, I'll start with like what is competitive enablement, and I'd say it's a fairly new term as well. You've
Mm,
probably, most listeners are probably more familiar with the term competitive intelligence, which has been around for decades and has been a highly strategic function for startups all the way up to very, very large enterprises. And I would say competitive enablement is a bit of a challenge to that status quo, which
mm,
is competitive intelligence of days past was typically a back office somewhere in an ivory tower doing deep competitive research on the market and providing those reports or trends to a select group of people, maybe to the executive team or maybe to a corporate strategy team. But it was fairly guarded. And where competitive enablement was really born from was, how do we make sure that those insights are enabling the entire business from wall to wall? I'd say the most popular or most valuable use case out of the gate is for revenue teams, salespeople, anyone that's customer facing. They need to know what their competitors are doing, what their competitors are saying, so that they can win and renew more business. And that was really the idea where enablement came from, and borrowing that from sales enablement or revenue enablement. And so, the analogy I like to use around competitive enablement versus competitive intelligence is that old saying, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it still make a sound? you could have all the best intelligence about your competitors in the world. You could know exactly what they're doing. You could be
Mm.
logged into their Slack and their email, but if your business isn't doing anything with that insight to win more business, to build better products, you're not it's not going to have any impact. No one was there to hear it. And so that's kind of competitive enablement in a quick 60-second pitch there. In terms of different stages, so pre-launch, at launch, and on an ongoing basis, I think that's a great way that we can kind of open up the aperture for our conversation,
Sure.
depending on where you're most interested, because I think it can mean different things depending on where you're at in those phases. So when you're pre-launch, whether it's a new startup or new venture or even just a new product or new feature, competitive enablement is going to be a lot of research gathering and analysis. So that's where maybe that traditional CI really found its roots. That being said, where the enablement comes in and where I think, again, the old way of doing things kind of falls short is in that pre-launch phase, at least in my experience and from a lot of competitive enablement professionals that I've spoken with, a lot of the best insights that they get in that stage are actually from the market. It's from customers, it's from
Mm.
buyers, it's from what we're hearing on the front lines, right? What does a really strong product manager do when they're building a product? They're talking to customers, they're talking to buyers. You said it yourself earlier, right? When you and Justin are working closely with 20 early access customers to really refine the product pre-launch. I mean, that is enablement right there. That's
Mm.
getting very close to your customers and your buyers. At launch, I think competitive enablement, that's where it can work really closely with, say, product marketing, right? Making sure that the positioning, the messaging is differentiated, right? The last thing you want is to, launch this big product, but not have anything particularly unique or anything that resonates with buyers. Doesn't have to be fully competitive in nature, right? But you do want to be aware of competitors in that launch phase. And then on an ongoing basis, I think that's where the traditional sense of enablement comes into play. So how are you making sure that your sellers, your salespeople, your customer teams are continuously enabled on
Mm.
the differences between your products and the competitors, and maybe what the competitors are now saying about your launch and those kinds of pieces. So I know that was a lot, but it was a big question. So I want to make sure
Yeah,
I
no,
address
I
all the pieces.
totally get it. And one thing that comes to mind I wanted to ask you was,
Mm,
you mentioned, when you're about to launch, really being able to work on, product marketing, messaging, and positioning, these sort of things, so they're differentiated enough. My question is always like, when you're working within a category and maybe there are competitors in that category, or maybe a lot of competitors, what's the balance in your from your perspective and your experience, between going like far too far out in fluffy storytelling and stuff, in an effort to differentiate, versus staying sort of like focused, and I don't want to say on brand because that's not what I'm trying to say, but it's more like focused and clear to understand, even if that is a similar message to what
mm,
your competitors are saying, right? Because it's like,
right.
I mean, that's one of the things sometimes people will, especially early stage startups, they'll, say something like, oh, I'm a platform for optimizing efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like,
Right.
what do you mean, right? So that's just an example of something that maybe is not really super focused, but at the same time you want to differentiate it, right? Because your
Mhm.
competitor might be saying a similar thing.
That's a really good question, and I think I don't have like a short answer, but I'll try to riff around that topic because I think
Sure.
it's super important. It's kind of the crux of really effective product marketing at the end of the
Yeah.
day, effective positioning. So there's a couple kind of like phrases and analogies that come to mind. One is an expression. I can't remember the original source, but just know it wasn't mine. It was something that I borrowed. But it's to be competitor aware and customer obsessed. And so I think this is for anyone that may be listening to this and thinking, don't focus on competitors. If you focus too much on competitors, then you're not focusing on your customers. I don't think it's either or. And I think the best companies are able to do both, right? We work with some of the like the largest B2B software companies in the world, and sorry, I should have provided context. I am at Klue and we provide competitive enablement software. So it's a very meta role where I'm doing competitive enablement at a competitive enablement software company. But we work with some of the like largest software companies in the world that are incredibly customer obsessed. Some of them, have basically coined the terminology around being customer obsessed. And yet they do have a very strategic function to make sure that they're understanding what their competitors are doing. And so I think it's not one or the other. I think, yes, of course, be obsessed with customers. They are what matter at the end of the day. However, you also want to be aware of what your competitors are saying and doing so that you can thread the needle and provide more value to your customers. And then the other piece that I mentioned, kind of maybe going the other way I kind of heard your question is, how do you balance between just speaking to maybe the clear value, which might be something that your competitors also say, versus, bringing in that differentiated lens. Again, I think it's a bit of a Venn diagram. Like, I think you can do both. I think there is that sweet spot. And I think that is where effective product marketing and positioning comes into play. Because if you go to market with something that's not differentiated, right, the market or buyers might say, oh, well, that sounds great, but I already have that with my existing tool or my incumbent. So are you doing that same thing, but faster or better or cheaper? That's where I think you need to have at least a bit of that differentiation in your messaging. And that's where competitive enablement can come into play, because competitive enablement is all about understanding, hey, incumbent competitor over here, they're not so great in this area, and that's where we can win. Or this incumbent over there, they're not so great in this other area, and this is where we can win. So
Yeah.
And last but not least, I'll mention this was something I picked up from like a revenue enablement playbook. I learned from our own revenue enablement team, but again, I don't think we coined it ourselves. But we really think of enabling our customer teams with kind of in three phases. There's why change, why us, and why now. And so I think your messaging needs to hit on all three. And competitive enablement, what it really aims to do is make sure that why us is incorporated. Because of course you want to communicate why change. Why is there a problem and why do you need to solve it? Why now is important so that you don't just, oh, this is an important problem, but like we'll talk to you next year and it's not that important to solve. There needs to be that urgency there. And then that why us is really, why our solution is the best solution.
I thought a lot about like not reinventing the wheel over the course of my career as a founder and just at organizations that I've worked with. And one thing that I always remember is like the social networks. Like I got into tech, almost 19, 20 years ago. And at the time there was MySpace and there were a variety of Friendster. There were a bunch of these networks, right? And so like the model of the social network was not a new thing. And like commenting and being able to post stuff was a vocabulary that was sort of standard. And then Facebook came and really like changed the game a lot, like the news feed and some some really interesting things. But when you posted, it was still a Facebook post, right? It was a post. And then Twitter came and called it a tweet, right? And it was this new paradigm. Twitter actually took a while to start to take off, right?
Yeah.
And I kept thinking to myself, boy, like why wouldn't you just call it a post? Because like a tweet is this new concept that's very, very specific to that product. Obviously, needless to say, it's taken off. I don't know what they're going to call it now. I still call Twitter, even though whatever, Elon's got a different take on it. But I remember always thinking to myself, is it a good idea to like, have to kind of rethink things or sort of reinvent the wheel? Like a post is still a post. If you were to explain, well, what is a tweet? Oh, it's a post, right? Like, that kind of like in describing it. And I think from a messaging perspective, right? Like, it's for me, and this is my question, like it's much easier to just be able to communicate something using the language of the customer, right? The language of the market so they can understand versus trying to come up with a new concept for something that already sort of exists out there. But again, I'm not Elon, right? I'm not quite sure. What's your take on that? Like that whole
Yeah,
concept?
it's a really interesting topic, and honestly, something that I've been dealing with in my product marketing role, over the past, year and a bit. Because yeah, I guess long-winded way of saying, like, I don't think there's a single right answer. I think it depends on a lot of factors, but I do think that there's a clear trade-off. And the way that I think about it now, I don't know if this is, the best way of thinking about it, but what I've come to realize is it's in a sense a high risk, high reward play to try to name something and brand something, because for every tweet that survived and like really won the hearts and minds of Twitter users and even non-Twitter users, quite frankly, there are probably a dozen, if not 100, product features that got a name and did not win the hearts and minds, and it just led to confusion because, the end user didn't understand, what is this tweet thing, or what is this, named thing. And I think, it's high risk, high reward. Like, obviously it paid off for Twitter because, Twitter eventually did build up that virality.
Yeah.
I think there also has to be something fairly unique about it, right? Like, when I think of a tweet, right, when you imagine a tweet, you imagine, what was it, 280 characters, or maybe it was 120 back in the day, but it's limited, right? And so that gave it something unique versus maybe a post on Facebook or on MySpace or on a blog. And so I think in a similar sense, there's probably, experts out there on product naming and product marketing that have a more fleshed out view. But I'd say I'm like you, George, where I am hesitant to, name something if it doesn't have to be named. And actually, I
Yeah.
was at a summit was it last year? About a year ago. It was one of the first summits I went to in person after the world reopened, and there was a product marketing leader talking about this exact topic, product naming. And one of her takeaways from her presentation was, not all things need a name.
Yeah.
So think about not naming as the name, because there is a trade-off once you name something a particular word. Because to your point, in your example, it worked out for tweet, but the Facebook wall, what happened to that? It's no longer a thing. Perhaps that name didn't have that same, connotation that ended up sticking. So
Yeah.
anyways, that's my kind of
Yeah.
unorganized thoughts on it.
Yeah, no. I mean, obviously, I share the same sort of sentiment. And from like a messaging perspective, one thing is having a salesperson on a call or in a meeting who's able to answer the question. What concerns me is when you're putting messaging out on marketing channels, websites, etc., and there's no one able to like actually dig in and explain it, right? And then you either
Right.
have to now spend text and messaging to explain the thing, and then it's, I don't know, it's then it feels a little weird. It's like, well, why don't you just say what it is, right, kind of thing. But
Right.
anyways, um well, let's dive in real quick into some key competitive intel assets that PMM should
Sure.
provide their sales and CS teams. Like, first of all, do you have any recommendations on that list? And then secondly, do you have a preferred framework on how to develop, share, and update those?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I have what I think is probably a hot take here. I think in the competitive enablement, competitive intelligence space, there's a lot of opinions around like assets, and there's maybe a bit of what's the right word? A There's a counteracting force against the idea of a battle card. I think battle cards are a great starting asset, and perhaps one of the most important assets for a competitive enablement team. And I'm going to flesh that out a little bit, because I think when you think of the word battle card, again, back to our earlier discussion, like, it has some loaded meaning. So I want to really clarify what I mean by battle card. Back in the day, like when I started, my sales career, I know I don't look it, but when I was selling back in the day, you would have a battle card printed out. It would be on your desk, or it'd be laminated. You put it in your backpack when you go meet with a customer. And the idea was, it was a cheat sheet. It was a card. It was a piece of paper, generally one piece of paper, maybe double-sided, but it had all the things that you needed to beat the competitor in a particular deal. So it would be easily referenceable. it was accessible, it was digestible. It was not a encyclopedia. It was not a, SharePoint folder with thousands, decks and docs in it. It was a single piece of paper. And that was a really important concept. Now, we now live in a digital era. It doesn't have to be an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, but I think those properties that made battle cards effective are still just as effective. It's still just as important, excuse me. They need to be accessible, right? Just in the same way that the card could be put on your desk or put in your backpack, it needs to be really easy for the salesperson to access. And so that might be in a platform like Klue, that might be, embedded into the tools that the sales team's already using. There's a lot of ways to accomplish that. The next is it has to be digestible. And again, this is probably the biggest culprit, I think, today with battle cards that I see in the wild, if you will, is they have reverted back to large, long documents. If you have to scroll on your screen, then it's not a battle card. That's probably too much content. And I know I'm oversimplifying. There are, of course, very complex enterprise softwares out there where there's a lot of detail needed, but it needs to be digestible. And so, you need to make it really easy for a sales rep to find the answer that they need. Make it searchable, as an example, right? If you're using a SharePoint or an enablement software, make sure that people can get to the answers they need really, really quickly. Maybe have an FAQ section, right? The frequently asked questions that sales reps often ask. That's really what I think that digestibility means. And last but not least, to break one of the limitations that battle cards had in the past, battle cards had to be printed. So if something changed, it was really difficult. You would have to go, the product marketing team or the sales enablement team would have to say, hey, everyone, here's the new battle card. Please update it. Throw out your old one. Now we have software. Battle cards can be dynamic. So what I would recommend is take advantage of that. Use dynamic content in your battle cards. Embed recordings of calls. Embed slides. So if the slide changes, your battle card changes. There are ways to take advantage of that so that you don't have like a PDF. A PDF is the worst format for a battle card because it's no better than a printed document. If the PDF changes, you have to communicate to your whole sales team, tell them to delete the old PDF and update it again. And so, anyways, I know I really dived into battle cards, but to zoom out a bit, why I think battle cards are so important is because that is the asset, that is the tool that is going to help your sales team win more revenue. And I think we're going to probably touch on this in terms of like what is a healthy competitive intelligence program. Unfortunately, a lot of competitive intelligence programs don't get a lot of attention, and we can dive into why. But if you can impact revenue, if you can show, hey, our battle cards are helping sales win more deals, or even just to have a specific deal that your battle card helped win, and it's a noteworthy logo, that is going to help your competitive enablement program grow more budget, grow more influence within the organization, and so on and so forth. And I think, yes, all the other assets are super important. Yes, you need to have a profile, you need to have a market map, you need to do a SWOT analysis, Porter's 5 forces, you name it. There's tons of assets that I think a competitive enablement program can have. But if you're not impacting revenue, I think you're on the clock,
Yeah.
and unfortunately in the era of profitability, I think it's a risk that I would not advise people take.
Yeah. Well, speaking of what a healthy competitive intelligence effort looks like, particularly within a SaaS company, any
Mhm.
sort of concepts come to mind for you?
Yeah, I think that was the first and foremost. If there's one thing that you take away from, my take, and by the way, of course, I recognize that I've drank the Klue Kool-Aid. It's also part of Klue. But if I were to leave Klue today, George, and I were to go and like competitive enablement is my expertise, I would probably go do competitive enablement at another company. I would 100% live and work by these principles. And so it's not just me, spouting the Klue narrative out here. This is what I would do if I were to move into another role. You need to impact revenue. That is, I would find the shortest path to impacting revenue. Make friends with sales. Figure out what their needs are. Impact one deal if you can, and start building off of that kind of quick win. So that's the first thing I would say. In terms of a healthy competitive intelligence effort more broadly, I think to leadership and how leadership perceives competitive intelligence and competitive enablement, because I think that's super critical. Way too many times do we unfortunately, see organizations where leadership either has one of two extreme views. One is we don't have any competitors, right? It's become a meme in our space. Oh, we don't have any competitors. That's not true, right? Like I can't think of a single company out there. If you know of one, let me know. But the only
Yeah.
companies out there that don't have competitors are monopolies, and you know legal and ethical pieces aside, I mean, there are very, very few monopolies in the world. So that's the first piece. The flip side and the other extreme is where leadership teams are very reactive to the competition. It's not a great place to be in when you're running a competitive enablement program. You have your, say, your 30, 60, 90-day plan, scoped out. And then your CEO pings you and say, "Hey, what's going on with this competitor? We need to understand what's going on with this competitor." That not only does that throw a wrench in your plans, and you have to drop things, and the actual doing of that work aside, I think it may, I don't want to prescribe anything, but it may indicate just an unhealthy relationship with the competitive landscape, right? I think it goes back to what I said earlier, right? A company should be customer obsessed and competitor aware. If you're competitor obsessed, that's where things I think can get a little bit dicey. And so that's not to take away from the importance of competitive enablement. It's really to say that there is a limit here. And if you're too obsessed with competition, that can actually lead to ineffective competitive enablement and ineffective competing in your market.
Got it. Awesome. You wrote a recent post that I thought was super compelling, and it was like, what would you do if a competitor copies you? Any sort of tips or feedback there?
Yeah, it's this is a fun one. If anyone's listening to this, I mean, it's not really a huge surprise in our space. I mean, we have competitors that do follow us, and I think, well, I mean, I'll just share from my experience. I think as a fairly very competitive person and someone that is highly principled. I like when I believe something, like I really believe it, and I want to support a particular cause or effort. Um, because of my personality, my initial reaction was to get angry and to get upset and to want to react to it. And I'll admit I have reacted in the past, and looking back, it was not beneficial to anyone by reacting, both personally and at a company level. So what I've come to appreciate is taking it as actually a very positive sign. And when a competitor copies us at Klue, and I'm sure it will happen in the future, right? It's not some one-off thing. Like, it happens in many competitive spaces. When a competitor copies you, as the competitive enablement expert, or if you're running the competitive intelligence program, I think people will look to you to see how you react, right? That's just kind of the nature of competitive intelligence. Something happened in our market. What does the competitive intelligence team think? I think in terms of emotions, it's just as important. So if you can kind of demonstrate a kind of quiet confidence that says, "Hey, this is great news," and the reason it's great news is because look, everyone wants to be a leader in their market, right? That's the definition of winning and competing, is you want to win in your market. And maybe winning isn't just being number one in terms of size. Maybe if there's a particular definition or a particular niche you want to win in. But I think I'd be hard pressed to find an objective that isn't about winning in some fashion. In order to win, you need to lead. And if you're going to lead, you're going to have followers. And when someone copies you, when a competitor copies you, you should really take that as a compliment, because that means that you are leading. You've taken a chance. You are spearheading the industry in some way that your competitor thought, they're doing a great job, let's do that. And I think that's a great message, is it not? And maybe you're wrong, but what does that tell you? That tells you that your competitor doesn't have a better option or better answer. And so, yeah, obviously, is it annoying? Does it sometimes get on, do I wish that our competitors were coming up with new ideas that we can then kind of test and see what buyers are preferring? Of course. But at the same time, I have to recognize, look, people are going to look to see how I'm reacting to that particular event. And I think the best thing that you can do in that situation is to just be okay with it and actually be happy and confident to go to your team and say, "This is great news, everyone. Here's why."
Hmm. Awesome. One last thing I wanted to ask you about,
Yeah, sure.
this notion of competitive confidence. What is it, and how do we do it? I sort
Yeah,
of you sort of alluded to a couple of things that I thought was interesting there, and just your response to the competitor copying you. That feels like a way to sort of cultivate confidence.
totally. And actually, this is I was telling you before, in the green room, George. This is such a great lineup of questions because they are very closely related. So when we talk about competitive confidence, oftentimes, like tactically speaking, we're generally referring to salespeople, right? Mr. or Mrs. Sales Rep, how confident are you against competitor A versus competitor B? Right? You can do that on a scale of 1 to 10, or very unconfident to very confident on like a scale of 5. Whatever it is, it's a great tool to prioritize because your biggest competitor might be the competitor that sales feels really good about going up against because they've come up against them so many times. But maybe there's a new startup or a new entrant that is building momentum and sales doesn't know how to respond to. So that's what we generally mean when we think of confidence as kind of like a tactical metric. But the way you asked that question and leading off of what we were just talking about, it's so important to recognize that confidence is not just some quantitative metric you can just like pump effort into and increase, right? Confidence is related to morale, energy. It's this kind of nebulous concept that you feel in a team, right? You mentioned you've been in tech, 15, 20 years. Like I'm sure you've been in tech companies where just the morale is off. The confidence is not at its all-time high. And for anyone that's been in a sales role before knows that confidence is a self-fulfilling prophecy,
Yep.
right? And so I'm very sensitive to team confidence, and I think that's why I'm so passionate about it, and I often write about it on LinkedIn, is when it comes to competitive confidence, if you're running that competitive enablement program, or even if you're a product marketer, maybe you don't have a dedicated compete program. I need to be clear here because a lot of companies don't, right? Generally, we see a dedicated competitive function at like 300 employees plus. So if you're in a startup, it's generally product marketing. And if you don't have product marketing, it's probably some combination of sales and marketing. But if you are seen as a subject matter expert on the competition, it's super important that you understand that confidence plays a huge role in the rest of the organization's kind of reading of your intel. It's not just what's happening in our market. It's how are we positioned and how do we feel about our competitor copying us, or our competitor getting acquired, or our competitor raising a monster Series C, right? We need to be that voice of reason. So sometimes, maybe internally I'm panicking. I'm like, oh my gosh, how did that just happen? I need to calm myself. I need to then kind of rally the troops if I need to, bring in stakeholders within the organization to then put together a response that is not going to damage confidence within the organization. And I think there's more to it than that. I mean,
Yeah.
I might not be doing it justice, but I think it is more an art than a
Yeah.
science. And I think just my advice would be very sensitive to it. Keep tabs on it, even though it's not this like physical, tangible thing. I mean, you can tell even if you're remote. You can tell in meetings. You can tell in Slack how the team is feeling, and not to get all woo woo, but I think it's super important.
Yeah, not woo woo at all. I mean, I think that's the thing, is that, we need to be, what I heard is, we need to be more human centric. We need to be more
Totally,
qualitative. And that's where the competitive advantages are, right? In my opinion,
absolutely.
like, having been a long time salesperson, sales leader, like, what made a great salesperson was not, sorry, my opinion, what I saw was not their ability to like memorize the deck, perfectly, or the training or whatever, right? It was their emotional intelligence, it was their ability to keep that confidence going, their ability to help others, right?
Hmm.
That's a huge one. to help others on
Totally.
their team, because there's nothing worse than having that egotistical like narcissist on your team that's just blowing up the culture. And these are the things that we don't talk, I think, often about. So I really appreciate us ending this episode with that qualitative stuff. Very much appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. And like on the topic of sales, like I was a Sandler trained rep, if you're familiar with the Sandler
Yeah,
methodology. And
absolutely.
there was the Sandler triangle, which was attitude, behavior, and technique. And they always said attitude is the one that matters the most, because if you don't have the attitude, you could have all the behaviors of the best salesperson and all the technique to, to be the best salesperson. But if you don't have that attitude, which is confidence, it's your ability to help others, it's your ability to stay positive, it's grit, it's resilience, it's all those, that emotional intelligence. You're not going to go far as a salesperson. And I think
Yeah.
that absolutely is relevant for the whole organization, and particularly in competitive enablement when you're dealing with, the other players in your market, and you need to be able to kind of weave your message and your company forward in that environment.
Awesome. Brandon, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. If folks wanted to follow you on social, I know you're pretty heavy on LinkedIn, but if they also wanted to learn more about Klue and maybe access other sources of content, what are the best URLs or handles to reach you?
Yeah, totally. So my LinkedIn is, I believe the URL is Brandon Bedford. If you search up Brandon Bedford on LinkedIn, I should be one of the top results. You can also go to Klue.com, which is where I work. Klue is a competitive enablement platform. But in terms of content, another place I'd recommend is what's called the Compete Network. So it's theCompeteNetwork.com. It's a completely free resource that is put on by Klue, but our vision with it is to be the Netflix of competitive enablement. It's completely free. It's podcasts, it's shows, it's newsletters, it's content creators that are building content for competitive enablement professionals and CROs and CMOs. And we also have a big summit coming up in November, so you can find more information at those websites. But anyways, that was a long enough plug. Find me on LinkedIn, and I'm always happy to chat.
Awesome, Brandon. Well, thank you so much. This was super awesome. And yeah, have a great day.
Awesome. Thanks, George. Great chatting with you.